how the generations work. So let me, first, if you're taking notes, write this down. Generations are calculated on where people fall in your enroller tree. They're calculated where people fall in your enroller tree, but they're paid out on where people are in your matrix or on people's matrix organizations. And I know that's a little confusing because they're calculated in the enroller tree, but paid out in the matrix. So let me give you a couple quick examples. And again, the video is super close. I hope by next week's call, it'll be out there so you guys can actually see the moving parts and how a generation is calculated, what it means. So let's say you're a platinum leader let's just say you're a gold, for example. We've got a ton of golds in this company. Let's say you're a gold. So you get paid 2 generations of silvers and 3 generations of gold matches. So let's just say in each leg, each enroller tree leg, if you enroll 10 people, you've got 10 enroller tree legs. Each one starts a new generation. So let's just say you're a gold. Let's say you have to have 100 people in your organization. So let's say you have 287 people in your organization. And let's just say, for sake of example, that none of them in any of your legs have achieved rank. All of that volume is your first generation silver. You're going to match. You have 287 people. You're getting a 10% silver match on all 287 of those people's matrix check, regardless of where they fall in the matrix. Plus, because they're also your first generation gold, I don't have the comp plan pulled up. What is it, 5%, I think? You also get a 5% first generation gold match. So you're matching all 287 of those people's checks. Not only are you getting paid on them in your matrix, but you're matching all of their matrix checks, regardless of where they fall in the matrix, 15% each. So if they make $100, you get $15. They make $50, you get $750. They make $500, you make 15% of $500, which is $65, right? So no, $75. But here's the cool thing, because a lot of those people are under a lot of those people in the matrix. So you might have enrolled this guy in your matrix. You also enrolled this guy. You also enrolled this guy. This guy enrolled this guy. This guy enrolled this guy, this guy, this guy. So you could be matching the same person's check literally 8, 10, 14 times in the matrix and getting paid on one person 14 different times, even though you're only matching that person's check once. I know that's confusing, but once you guys understand it and see that video, it makes a whole lot of sense. Now, let's say, just for example, let's say one of the people in one of your legs, let's say leg 4, you got someone hit gold on the 3rd level of leg 4, that person hit gold. Still, everyone in all of those other legs, since there's no ranked people, that's still your first generation silver and your first generation gold. In leg 4, down to that person, down to level 3 where that person is, you've got that's still, and if that first person has enrolled 100 people, all of that volume is still your first generation gold and your first generation silver. Now, under that gold person, since a gold is also a silver, now that's your 2nd generation silver and 2nd generation gold. So still, you're going to match 10% 2nd generation on everyone under them and 5% 2nd generation gold on everyone under them in that leg, regardless of where they are in the matrix. So hopefully that cleared it up a little bit. I don't want to go into too much crazy detail, but when you guys fully understand it, it's not, because with the way Tim was explaining it, he's like, when someone hits silver, I match them. No, you don't just match them. You don't just match the ranked person. You match literally everyone in their entire organization down to the next ranked person. And that's another generation that you still get paid on. And when you get to diamond, you get 5 generations of diamonds. So even that doesn't mean if you have 5 diamonds in your organization, you're blocked out. No, you're still getting, because they're probably not all going to be in the same leg. Maybe they will. You have 5 diamonds in one leg, but still you're matching all of that multiple times. And you'll see exactly what I mean when that video comes out. But guys, it is powerful. And that's how, I love Curry's example. You want 100 people that you make 25 cents on in the matrix, or do you want to match all those people? And that's the difference between $25 and literally thousands with the same number of people in your organization. So huge difference there. Go out, be a spillover creator, not a spillover waiter.